Good evening, Prof. Thanks very much for coming through on this important day, of course. Look, I mean, from what the Amnesty International report is telling us, even though, the equality remains a hot topic, people are focusing on it a lot, but when all has been said and done, women continue to bear the brunt of inequality, even though there's been a great deal of focus on this issue.
Well, you're right to point the importance of 70 years ago passing this very first international human rights agreement, but it was only a declaration. At the same time, it was said then, and is true now, this is not a sprint. This is a marathon. It's never done. We're all imperfect.
70 years down the line.
70 years is, by the history of our species, it's not a very long time. And look at the progress. When in 1948, the initial declaration was passed 48-0, there were 10 abstentions, or 8 abstentions, and one of those was South Africa because of apartheid. Now you've got a constitution, there's a constitution that we all support here that is the first 15 pages about human rights, very comprehensive, social rights, rights of women. Those are not always honored, but we know what we should do better, and that's progress, and so we just have to keep struggling.
Well, I mean, Amnesty International lists a number of areas where women in particular still bear the brunt of inequality. And one of them, incidentally, is an issue that is very topical in our country today, and that's the question of land, because lack of security of tenure is affecting women the most, and they are the most vulnerable when it comes to such things as evictions, for example.
Well, of course, and the aspirational document of the Universal Declaration did include social and economic rights, just as the UN Charter does. Now, many countries have opposed that. The United States has been particularly slow. South Africans are debating this issue in its historic context that's particular to this country. But again, if we didn't have the Universal Declaration behind us, we'd be a little less empowered than we are, because these are now international norms.
But isn't there a bit of an absurdity, if you like, Prof, in that, I mean, look at our Constitution that you've just spoken about now, which you say details, everything that needs to be done. And even though we may not have achieved a lot of what we would have wanted to achieve, at least we know where we should go. And I suppose I would imagine the same argument can be made against the United Nations. You look at this big and probably the most important international organization in the world, but when you look at such things as the Security Council, how undemocratic it is that a handful of nations can basically decide the future or the fate of the world.
Well, you make a very good point in 2018, but when the United Nations was founded in 1945, it was founded by the victors of the Second World War who were trying to prevent a Third World War. They thought the Security Council would be the bulwark. This was before the Cold War. This would be the bulwark against the risk of another major war, and then they built the international financial institutions to prevent a Great Depression. And Eleanor Roosevelt and her multinational team of legal scholars put together the Universal Declaration, which the governments would only agree to as a declaration. So, yes, there needs to be these kind of reforms. How do you get there? Well, in the old days, the strong would determine and the weak would go along. Today, we at least negotiate, but you got to keep pushing. We all have to keep pushing.
Oh, no, but as the administration of one George Bush has shown, even in 2018, with all the good and the achievements that you are talking about, there are still you still have the big bullies who, if they want to go it alone, tell the world that this is what we're going to do, take or leave.
Well,
and they do get away with it.
Well, we've got right now a Donald Trump whose administration says we don't want to support human rights because we have more important economic or security concerns. That's total nonsense. I think it was really right when Mrs. Ogata, who was the head of the Refugee Commission, said, today's human rights abusers are tomorrow's refugees. The AU Constitutive Act now has provisions for responsibility to protect, which are not yet implemented, but they also have this principle of non-indifference about the internal affairs of states, where abuses of power, where severe corruption and deprivation elicit an international response. The South African apartheid regime was the first one to provoke a UN declaration or UN resolution, Security Council resolution, on the grounds that human rights were a threat to international security. Yes, it's slow, and yes, you're right, and yes, the United States, of course, which claims to be a democracy, has been the most resistant. But when Mrs. Roosevelt sponsored this declaration, there was segregation, like apartheid in the United States, throughout much of the South. So we've had an African-American president. Now we've got this crazy man, Trump. It's not perfect. Democracies can only be experiments that are improved upon. Same with human rights, but we just need to draw everyone's attention to it, which is why you're spending time on this tonight, and I applaud that.
Exactly, and you're correct, Prof. We shouldn't just focus on what is wrong or problematic. Perhaps on a day like this, we should remind people that there have been a lot of UN conventions that have changed the world for the better with regard to torture, arms control, and so on. There have been a lot of protocols like as far as child soldiers are concerned, something which has been outlawed in most parts of the world
the United States
and we owe that, yes, exactly.
And the International Criminal Court, by the way, which we're debating in this country.
Okay, Prof. Before I let you go, can I ask just your thoughts on Brexit? What's going on in the UK today? Apparently it was supposed to come before, there was some bill supposed to come before Parliament tomorrow, which apparently is no longer going to be the case.
I don't know exactly what's going to happen next. None of us do. But the important point, I think, for South Africans or any democracy to realize is a referendum is not democratic. It's a quick fix that a politician decides wants to get a yes or no vote. There wasn't deliberation about this Brexit thing in the British society. And now the reactions are setting in because people are saying, oh my goodness, look what we've missed. People sometimes complain South Africans talk too much about problems. You have to talk these problems through a democratic way. So I'm very glad you asked that, because the lesson for me is don't have referendums.
But, well, even after talking at times, we don't get it right either.
Well, of course, but we're human.
Okay, Prof, thanks very much for coming through. Professor John Stremlau from Wits University's International Relations Department.